My husband Robert once told me, "From now on, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. Stop chasing me." And honestly, I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you. You are never and will never be anywhere near my level. So, I stopped. 2 weeks of cold, absolute silence later, he showed up at my workplace, holding a wilting bouquet, wanting back the woman he thought he'd broken. The sheer, mind-numbing audacity of it, standing there in the sun-drenched lobby of Piedmont Elementary like some hot mess, straight out of a really bad rom-com that was just cancelled. He actually expected me to fall into his arms and apologize for making him feel lonely. But let's back up, way back up, to the Tuesday night in October when those words first dropped like a chunk of frozen steel into the deep end of my soul. Robert said those exact chilling words to me while I stood in our dining room, wearing the little black dress I'd picked out to celebrate my Teacher of the Year award for the entire Capital District. He came home a full 3 hours late to the special dinner I'd prepared, barely glanced at the mahogany table set with our wedding china, the Lenox pattern we got from his snobbish aunt, and the flickering, expensive candles. He didn't see the love, the effort, or the celebration. He only saw an opportunity for what he clearly considered an overdue, patronizing correction to our marriage. He declared that from now on, he would be the one to decide when we talked or spent time together. I needed to immediately stop chasing him around like some desperate, underfed puppy begging for table scraps of his attention. He literally stood there, comparing our respective salaries as if human worth was some equation you could solve on a single spreadsheet. My $48,000 a year as a second-grade teacher, pouring my entire heart and soul into securing little kids' futures, versus his upcoming massive partnership at one of the most prestigious big law practices in the state, a promotion that would easily triple his current income. He stood there, in his flawlessly tailored designer suit, and declared we were simply, mathematically, not equals. Then he just walked right past me, straight into his cavernous, mahogany-panelled home office, and closed the solid oak door with a chilling, echoing click. Just like that. The sound was deafening. I was left standing there alone, the cold salmon congealing on the fine china, the expensive candles slowly burning down to their wicks, the perfect California Cabernet sitting unopened. But I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't beat my fists on that expensive door demanding answers or basic human decency. Instead, something cold, clear, and utterly unbreakable settled inside me. It felt like the perfect, flawless sheet of ice forming on a deep, dark Minnesota lake in the dead of winter. If my husband wanted silence and distance, if he truly believed marrying me, Quinn, had been an act of lowering his status, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would comply so perfectly that 2 weeks later, he'd be the one standing in the brightly lit public school lobby, holding wilted roses and begging for the woman he thought he'd completely broken. The crushing cruelty of that night wasn't an accident. It had been building for months, a slow, insidious, toxic erosion of respect that I, in my blind hope, kept making pathetic excuses for. I'd spent all afternoon preparing that dinner. The salmon was pan-seared exactly the way Robert's mother had shown me back when she was still pretending I was good enough for her precious boy. The asparagus was roasted absolutely perfectly with just the right hit of olive oil and sea salt. I'd driven to 3 different liquor stores, a total exhausting trek across 2 different counties, just to find the specific Napa Valley Cabernet he preferred, the kind that cost $40 a bottle, which was a significant, noticeable chunk of my teacher's salary. I'd pulled out the wedding china we only used for truly special occasions, precious pieces we got 3 years ago from relatives who genuinely thought they were investing in a lasting, loving partnership. The whole setup was supposed to be a moment. After 6 hard-fought years of teaching second grade, of pouring every ounce of energy and passion into helping little 7-year-olds in the district learn to read and write and think critically, I'd been selected as Teacher of the Year. It was a massive, career-defining validation. The recognition came with a small bonus, which I had already mentally earmarked for the crippling student loans I was still paying off. The same exact loans I'd taken out to keep us afloat when Robert was finishing up law school, and I was working a second job just to pay the rent on our tiny apartment in Boston. I desperately wanted to share that moment with him. I wanted Robert to look at me the way he used to, in our first year, when he'd introduce me at fancy firm events with his hand possessively on the small of my back and tell people I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I wanted him to be fiercely proud of me, the way I'd been fiercely proud of him when he passed the bar exam, when he won his first big case, when the managing partner first started whispering his name as partnership material. But 6:30 came and went. No word, except a 5 o'clock text that was basically a legal notice saying he'd be home by 6:30. I checked my phone like an obsessive teenager waiting for a date, watching the minutes bleed into hours. 7 o'clock, then 8 o'clock. The salmon was still in the oven, warm, but losing its perfect, delicate texture, turning into a brick. The candles were melting down, wax pooling into the crystal holders. I texted him twice, asking if everything was okay, if he was still coming, and got absolutely nothing back, just completely ghosted. By 9 o'clock, worry had curdled into a cold, hard, unshakable resignation. This was the pattern, the miserable cycle of disrespect. Hours late, no explanation, no apology. I had spent 6 months of my life being the queen of excuses. He's under tremendous pressure. The partnership review is consuming him. Important clients need attention at unpredictable hours. I told myself these lies repeatedly, constructing elaborate, pathetic justifications for behavior that, deep down, I knew was simply just disrespect, dressed up in a Tom Ford suit and labelled as professional obligation. When the front door finally opened at 9:30 p.m., I stood up from the dining room table. I was sitting there alone in the dim candlelight, and a little flicker of irrational hope, the last dying ember of my marriage, lifted my heart. Maybe he'll apologize. Maybe he'll finally see the effort. Maybe we can salvage this. Robert walked in wearing that expensive suit, his tie already loose and discarded. His attention was fixed, absolutely glued to his phone screen. He didn't look up. He didn't register the dinner, the fine china, the flickering candles. He just walked past the dining room toward his office, his thumbs moving across the screen in that constant, familiar typing motion that had somehow become more intimate to me than his actual loving touch. I moved fast, intercepting him in the hallway before he could disappear behind that closed door. The words came out in a rush, bright and desperate, a kind of eager, wounded sound that makes me literally cringe now just thinking about it. I told him about the award, Teacher of the Year, the recognition ceremony at the district gala next month. My voice was carrying all my hope, all my excitement, all my desperate, aching need for him to care, to just give me the smallest sign that my professional accomplishments mattered to him. He held up one hand without even looking at me, one small dismissive gesture. That, honestly, was worse than anything he said afterward. It was the way you'd silence a server trying to refill your water glass while you're mid-conversation with someone who actually matters. It was dehumanizing. He stopped in the hallway and finally looked up from his phone, and the look on his face wasn't pride or interest. It was pure, distilled irritation that I had delayed him from whatever he considered more important than this incredibly personal conversation. What he said next came out in the clinical, precise, and utterly warmless voice he probably used to deliver bad, devastating news to opposing counsel. He said we needed to establish some new ground rules for our marriage. The phrase was so rehearsed, so devoid of life, I knew he'd been planning this epic fail speech for a long time. From now on, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. You need to stop chasing me around like a desperate puppy, begging for scraps of attention. It's exhausting, he said. And then, the kicker, and frankly, beneath both of us. He didn't even look up fully from his screen while telling me this, as if he couldn't spare his full attention even for the task of restructuring our marriage and demolishing my spirit. Then came the words, the ones that would echo in every sleepless night to come. He said he couldn't believe he had ever lowered himself enough to marry me, that I was never and would never be anywhere near his level. He laid it out like a legal argument, a devastating mic drop moment in his own private courtroom. I was a second-grade teacher, making a paltry $48,000 a year. He was about to make partner at one of the most prestigious law practices in the state, with a salary that would be at least triple mine. We were not equals, he declared, and he was tired of pretending we were. The comparison was delivered as irrefutable fact, as if my human worth and dignity could be accurately calculated by comparing our annual incomes and finding me catastrophically insufficient. And then he walked past me, closed the door to his office, and the sound of that click echoed through our beautiful, empty home with a terrible, heart-stopping final sound. I stood there, rooted to the spot, hearing the faint sound of his voice already on a conference call, conducting business that mattered more than the wife he had just absolutely demolished and abandoned. I walked slowly back to the dining room. I looked at the table, the cold salmon, the congealing asparagus, the expensive wine sitting opened, the candles burning low. Everything was transformed. It was no longer a beautiful celebration. It was evidence of my foolish, pathetic hope and fundamental inadequacy. This is what happens, I thought, when someone making $48K a year tries to pretend she deserves basic respect or recognition from someone about to make partner at a prestigious firm. But I didn't cry. That's the part that surprised me later. Instead of grief or heartbreak, something else arrived, completely uninvited. Something cold, clear, and utterly merciless. Like steel being forged in a terrifying fire, hardening instantly. The man I'd supported through law school, the man I'd taken out loans for, the man whose last name I carried, had just told me I would never be good enough. That my worth was purely transactional, calculable on a spreadsheet. That our marriage was an act of charity on his part, not a partnership between equals. I stood there, staring at that closed office door, and I made a decision that was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. If Robert wanted silence, if he wanted to decide when we communicated, if he truly believed I was so far beneath him, I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would honor his request with such perfect, devastating compliance that he would eventually realize the catastrophic, life-altering error he had just made. I would respect his boundaries so thoroughly that he would finally understand what his meticulously planned life actually looked like without the invisible support system, without me, his $48K a year personal assistant, managing everything for him for 3 long years. I moved through the dining room like I was performing a solemn ritual for the very last time. I cleared the table. I wrapped the cold, uneaten salmon and put it in the fridge, knowing I'd throw it away days later. I blew out the candles and watched the thin trails of smoke curl up to the ceiling. I put away the wedding china, piece by precious piece, wondering if we'd ever use it again. Deep down, I already knew the tragic answer. Then I picked up that $40 bottle of expensive Cabernet and poured the entire thing down the kitchen sink, watching the dark, rich liquid swirl away. $40, disappearing down the drain, a perfect fitting symbol for the evening and perhaps for our entire broken marriage. I walked upstairs, not to our luxurious master bedroom, but to the dust-covered guest room, and closed that door. I created my own impenetrable boundary in cold response to his. Sleep didn't come that night, but a terrifying, brilliant plan did. I lay in that unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, and I began to think through what came next with a surprising laser-like clarity. Despite the shock still reverberating through my system, Robert had just handed me a gift and out without realizing the magnitude of what he had done. He'd given me permission to stop trying, permission to stop walking on eggshells, permission to stop being the only person in our marriage who seemed to care if it survived. He had declared the new rules of engagement, and I would follow those rules with such perfect robotic obedience that he would be forced to face the harsh reality of what he had truly, irrevocably lost. I can tell you're absolutely hooked. You're holding your breath, waiting to see what happens next. But let me ask you, are you currently living your life for someone else? Are you giving your best energy, your most precious years to a person who tells you you're not enough? If this gut-wrenching story resonates, if the fear of staying in a relationship that completely diminishes you is a very real, sinking feeling, then don't hesitate. Subscribe right now. This entire story is a roadmap to financial and emotional freedom, and if you click away now, you might miss the one single truth that saves you years of future pain and regret. Don't be the one who regrets waiting too long to save yourself. If you're still on the fence, go ahead and comment, "I won't subscribe because I'm afraid to change." And let's discuss why that debilitating fear is holding you back from your victory. The very next morning, I woke before dawn and moved through our silent, beautiful house with a brand new, terrifying purpose. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, but only 1 cup. My cup. I prepared breakfast, but only enough for 1 person. When Robert emerged from the master bedroom around 7, still adjusting his expensive cufflinks and checking his phone, the perfect image of the successful attorney, the big shot, he stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. The confusion on his face was brief, but it was absolutely visible. For 3 years, I had been his living, breathing, invisible personal assistant, his egg white omelette with precisely chopped organic vegetables, his whole wheat toast, his coffee, prepared exactly how he liked it, 1 sugar, a splash of cream, and the temperature perfectly hot but not scalding. The routine had been so consistent, so automatic, that he had long since stopped thinking about it, had simply come to expect it, the way you expect the electricity to work when you flip a switch. I sat at the kitchen table, calmly drinking my coffee, eating my simple breakfast. I looked at him, not with anger or hostility, but with an unsettling, peaceful calm. I politely informed him that I assumed he would prefer to handle his own meals going forward. Since he was so incredibly capable, and I was apparently so far beneath his standards, my service was obviously no longer required. The words were polite. There was no trace of anger, no sarcasm, no emotional charge, and that seemed to confuse him more than the absence of his bespoke breakfast. Robert opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it, the words catching in his throat. He grabbed his expensive briefcase from the counter. Normally, I would have had his dry cleaning receipt and a reminder about his afternoon client meeting clipped to the handle. None of those little, invisible acts of service were there now. He stood for a moment looking around the kitchen like a tourist who couldn't read the map, searching for something he couldn't quite identify. Then he headed for the door. I watched him go, making absolutely no move to offer the kiss goodbye that had once been automatic, offering no reminder of his client meeting, asking no question about what time he'd be home for dinner. The door closed behind him, and I sat alone in the kitchen with my coffee. The silence that settled around me no longer felt tense or uncomfortable. It felt full of potential. It felt like freedom. The silence of pure, delicious independence. The beginning of my strategic withdrawal was harder than I'd anticipated, but not for the reasons you might think. I didn't miss Robert. I didn't feel lonely or sad or regretful about my decision to give him the complete silence he had demanded. What proved difficult was physically breaking 3 years of deeply ingrained, carefully constructed habits. My body had learned to operate a certain way, always catering to him, and now I was asking it to unlearn everything. I sat at my desk during morning recess at Piedmont Elementary in the Midwest. My phone lay next to my lesson planner. I caught my hand reaching for it without conscious thought, pure muscle memory. My thumb moved toward the screen, preparing to type the usual text. "How's your big morning going? Need me to pick up anything on my way home, honey?" I stopped myself just before touching the screen and snatched my hand back as if the phone had suddenly become scalding hot. This impulse fight happened again during my planning period, and again while my second graders were at lunch. Each time, I had to actively override the ingrained behavior that had been reinforced daily for 3 years. I decided to immediately redirect that wasted energy. I picked up the phone and texted my sister Michelle instead. I asked if she wanted to grab dinner sometime that week. We hadn't spent quality time together in months because I always seemed to have something I needed to do for Robert. Michelle responded almost instantly with enthusiasm and 3 exclamation points, saying she'd been worried about me and would love to catch up over tacos. Then I messaged my old college friend Riley, who I had practically ghosted because Robert always needed me during the evening hours when I might have been maintaining friendships. Riley wrote back with that perfect blend of sass and love, saying she thought I had forgotten she existed and suggested we meet for drinks Friday after school. I even responded to an email from Madison, the sharp 5th grade teacher down the hall, whose lunch invitations I'd declined at least half a dozen times over the last year because I was always rushing home to make sure Robert had a proper, home-cooked dinner waiting. When I finally walked into the teacher's lounge that afternoon, carrying my little lunch bag, Madison looked up from her salad with genuine, beautiful surprise. She was sitting alone at one of the small round tables, grading a massive stack of papers, and her face genuinely brightened when she saw me. I asked if I could join her, and she immediately shuffled her papers to make room. We talked about absolutely nothing important. Madison told me about the epic vacation to Costa Rica she was planning for spring break. She showed me photos of the Eco Lodge on her phone, complaining about a difficult parent conference she was dreading, and sharing her thoughts on the new principal's totally questionable policy changes regarding standardized testing prep. I realized, as we talked, just how much I had missed this simple conversation with another adult about topics that had nothing to do with managing Robert's demanding needs, anticipating his fickle moods, or making sure his life ran perfectly smooth. Madison then asked me how my week was going, and I found myself telling her about the Teacher of the Year award. Her reaction was everything Robert's should have been, multiplied by 10. She grabbed my arm and actually squealed with excitement, saying I absolutely deserved the recognition, and that I was one of the best, most dedicated teachers in the whole district. We spent the rest of lunch discussing the upcoming ceremony, what I should wear. Go bold, Quinn, she insisted, and whether I'd give a speech. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, I felt physically lighter, as if the simple act of being seen and celebrated by someone who genuinely cared had released a massive amount of crushing pressure I hadn't even realized I was carrying. By day 3, something truly unexpected and foundational shifted. I woke up that morning, went through my routine, and somewhere around the time I was brushing my teeth, I realized I hadn't thought about Robert even once, not one single time. I hadn't wondered what time he would be home. I hadn't mentally reviewed his schedule to anticipate his needs. I hadn't checked my phone to see if he'd sent any messages overnight. The realization stopped me dead in my tracks, toothbrush still in my mouth. For the first time in 3 years, Robert was not the demanding, resource-draining background program constantly running in my mind. At school that day, I taught my second graders about the water cycle with genuine, focused enthusiasm. We did a super cool experiment with ice cubes and warm water to demonstrate evaporation and condensation. I was fully, completely present in the moment, not mentally planning dinner or worrying about whether I had forgotten some piece of Robert's daily maintenance checklist. During recess, I helped settle a pretty serious dispute between 2 boys fighting over who got to use the basketball court. I handled it with patience and humor instead of the distracted, rushed efficiency I'd been operating with for months. I planned the following week's lessons without once checking my phone for a text. The vast, empty mental space that had been entirely consumed by managing his constant requirements was suddenly, gloriously, available for my own things. I felt physically lighter, like I'd been carrying a heavy lead backpack for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without that crippling weight pressing down on my shoulders. During my lunch break with Madison, I actually tasted my food, noticed the flavor of the fresh apple slices, the texture of the sandwich, the cold, welcome sweetness of the iced tea I had brought from home. Madison noticed the change before I fully articulated it myself. She watched me, tilted her head, and said I seemed different somehow. Lighter was the exact word she used. She asked if something good had happened, and I just told her I was making some life adjustments. She didn't push for details. She was too classy for that. But she gave me that knowing smile, the kind that passes between women who understand that the best changes sometimes come from finally letting go of the things that were truly weighing you down. The transformation accelerated with each passing day after that, gathering a powerful, unstoppable momentum like a huge boulder rolling downhill. I started going to the gym before school again, something I had entirely abandoned because Robert used to complain that I was never home in the mornings. The complaint had never even made sense because he left for his office before 6 o'clock a.m. anyway. But I had stopped going because his criticism always made me feel instantly guilty. Now I fully reclaimed that morning routine. I drove to the gym at 5:30, spent 45 minutes on the treadmill and weight machines, and arrived at school feeling energized, ready to take on the world instead of already drained and walking on tiptoes. I reconnected with old friends I had let completely drift away over those 3 toxic years. Riley and I met for drinks on Friday evening at a trendy wine bar downtown in San Francisco, and we talked for 3 solid, uninterrupted hours without me once checking my phone to see if Robert needed anything. My college friend Clara invited me to a weekend brunch, and I accepted without the automatic, anxious calculation of whether Robert might want me around that day. These friendships had been neglected because Robert always seemed to need something during the precious hours I might have spent maintaining connections outside our marriage. I hadn't fully realized how truly isolated I had become until I started rebuilding those bridges. On Wednesday evening of my second week, I did something I'd wanted to do for ages. I signed up for a pottery class at the local community centre. The class met every Wednesday from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock p.m. Time I would normally have spent meticulously preparing some elaborate, unappreciated dinner. I walked into the studio feeling nervous and excited. I was greeted by Olivia, the instructor. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with short silver hair and clay permanently embedded under her fingernails. She had the kind of face that suggested she had lived through some seriously difficult stuff and emerged stronger and wiser. Olivia welcomed me with genuine warmth and showed me to a pottery wheel in the corner. She demonstrated how to center the clay, her hands moving with practiced, decades-long confidence. I tried to copy her movements, but my first attempt was an utter disaster, collapsing into a misshapen, mushy lump within seconds. Olivia laughed kindly and told me everyone starts there. She said learning pottery requires patience and a total willingness to fail, repeatedly, before anything good emerges. Then she shared something deeply personal. She'd been teaching pottery for 20 years, she said, after her second divorce had completely forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. She had needed something that was entirely, unequivocally hers, something nobody could criticize, diminish, or take away. Pottery became that thing for her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I had said, and she told me, "Sometimes the best things we create come from the rubble of what we thought we wanted." Her words settled over me like a powerful blessing. I worked the clay for the rest of the class, and while nothing I made was remotely presentable, I felt something shift deep inside me. I was building something new from the ruins of my marriage, and it was going to be entirely mine. On day 7, exactly 1 week after he walked past me, I made a decision that felt both absolutely terrifying and completely necessary. During my lunch break, I drove to a bank across town in a different county, where Robert would never, ever have reason to go. I walked into the building, my heart pounding like a drum solo, and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. The banker, a sharp young woman who looked fresh out of a Big Ten college, walked me through the paperwork with clinical efficiency, never asking why I wanted an account entirely separate from any joint finances. I opened a checking account in only my name and authorized the bank to set up automatic small transfers from my paycheck, amounts so tiny Robert would never notice them missing. I was building a financial safety net, a stash, that existed entirely outside his knowledge or control. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a top-tier divorce attorney. I found Amelia Reeves through an online search for lawyers specializing in high-asset divorces, where one spouse had a significantly higher income. Her office was downtown in a stunning high-rise building in Manhattan, and it smelled like expensive leather and quiet, unshakable power. Amelia listened to my story with the focused intensity of a predator, calculating exactly how much my husband was going to pay for his stunning arrogance. She took notes in precise, elegant handwriting and asked incredibly detailed questions. She wanted to know about our finances, about the student loans I had taken out to support Robert through law school, about the 2 jobs I had worked while he was studying for the bar exam. She informed me that in our state, his upcoming partnership and the significant salary increase that came with it would be considered marital property, subject to division, especially since I had financially supported his education and early career. When she smiled at this information, it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Robert regret every single cruel word he had ever spoken to me. I left her office with a detailed plan and a clear timeline, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday night, I felt something warm begin to bubble up inside me. It felt like hope, real, solid hope. You've watched Quinn take the first steps to reclaiming her power, but let's be real. The truth is, most people are too scared to actually follow through. They let fear keep them small and silent, trapped in a cage of someone else's making. If you are truly serious about taking back control of your life, if you refuse to let anyone diminish your worth again, then you know exactly what you need to do to prove it. Hit that subscribe button now and join the ranks of those who stand up for themselves and fight back. If you refuse to subscribe, that means you're ultimately comfortable letting people walk all over you and decide your fate. Go ahead, comment. I refuse to subscribe because I'd rather stay quiet, and explain why you're okay with letting others decide your absolute worth. The subtle changes in Robert became visible around day 10 of my silence. Subtle at first, but accumulating into something I could no longer ignore, even if I'd wanted to. I started noticing things during those brief, awkward moments when our paths crossed in the silent, beautiful house we still technically shared. He would emerge from the master bedroom in the morning, looking visibly disoriented, moving through the kitchen with the confused energy of someone navigating a completely unfamiliar territory. I could hear him opening cabinets and closing them again, the sounds punctuated by long, anxious pauses that suggested he was desperately trying to remember where things were supposed to be, or perhaps wondering why they were no longer where he expected them to be. His favorite, oversized ceramic coffee mug sat unused in the cabinet. For 3 solid years, that mug had been waiting for him every single morning, filled with coffee prepared exactly how he liked it. Now, it gathered dust while I used my own mug and made only enough for myself. I would stand at the counter, preparing my breakfast, and watch him in my peripheral vision as he opened the cabinet, saw the empty mug, and closed the cabinet again without ever taking it out. He never asked me to make his coffee. He never even mentioned the absence of the routine we'd maintained for so long. But I could clearly see the confusion in his posture, the way he stood there for a few extra, lost seconds, as if waiting for something to magically materialize that simply no longer would. The dry cleaning situation provided another clear source of visible bewilderment. Every Thursday for 3 years, I had picked up his dress shirts and suits from the cleaner on my way home from school. The timing was perfect. The cleaner was right between Piedmont Elementary and our house, and Robert always had evening meetings that required freshly pressed, perfect attire. Now, his dress shirts hung in the cleaner's storage area with little yellow tickets attached, completely unclaimed. I no longer considered his wardrobe maintenance part of my responsibilities. On Thursday evening of the second week, I heard him on the phone with the dry cleaner, his voice carrying a distinct mix of irritation and total confusion about why his perfectly scheduled clothes had not been picked up as usual. The kitchen told its own clear, devastating story of deterioration. The groceries I used to purchase and organize according to his specific fastidious preferences were long gone, replaced by items I wanted to eat, with zero regard for his expensive tastes. I bought the snacks I liked, the breakfast foods that were easy for one person, the ingredients for simple meals I could make quickly after work. Robert would open the refrigerator and stand there, staring at the contents as if the items inside were written in an ancient foreign language he could not decipher. He was desperately looking for the meticulously prepared meals I used to have waiting, the ingredients for his favorite Sunday sauce, the specific organic brand of yogurt he preferred. None of it was there anymore. I would simply walk past him during these moments of deep confusion without offering help or asking if he needed anything. I maintained the pleasant but completely distant demeanor you might use with a housemate you barely knew, not a husband you had shared a life with for 3 years. When our paths crossed, I smiled politely and kept moving. When we were both in the kitchen, I prepared my food and ate it without engaging in conversation beyond basic pleasantries about the weather or reminding him that trash day was Thursday. One evening, near the very end of that second week, Robert finally broke the silence I had been so carefully maintaining. I was sitting in the living room reading a thrilling mystery novel about a woman who systematically destroyed her abusive ex-husband's life through careful, patient execution. A delightful, ironic coincidence, truly. Robert came out of his office around 8:00 and stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment before speaking. His voice, when he finally asked if everything was okay, carried a hint of uncertainty I had never, ever heard before. It was tentative, almost vulnerable, completely unlike the booming, confident attorney voice he used for literally everything else in his life. I looked up from my book and smiled at him with the same pleasant, clinical distance I had been maintaining since that terrible Tuesday night. I told him everything was fine. I was just respecting his boundaries and giving him the space he had requested. I calmly reminded him that he had said he would decide when we talked or spend time together. Are you scared of being powerful? Waiting for him Are you worried that supporting the story of flawless, calculated justice will challenge the status quo? How could he possibly complain that I was giving him exactly what he had demanded 2 weeks ago? You are one click away from joining a community that believes in fighting back. Lawyer trying to find a fatal flaw in an argument that was logically part of the problem. Go to the comments right now and type, as if to argue, I am choosing to remain harmless, and live with that decision. Finally, he just nodded, turned around, and went back into his office. I returned to my book and felt a small, powerful surge of satisfaction deep in my gut. The trap I had so patiently set was working exactly as intended. Day 12 brought a new development that told me my strategy was having the desired, destabilizing effect. My phone rang during lunch period while I was sitting in the teacher's lounge with Madison and 2 other teachers. We were discussing an upcoming field trip to the Science Museum, the usual teacher debate over whether to arrange a guided tour or let the students explore on their own. When Robert's name appeared on my screen, his full professional name, because I had changed his contact name to something formal, I glanced at it briefly and simply declined the call without interrupting my conversation. I went right back to my turkey sandwich and continued talking about the field trip logistics as if nothing had happened. Madison caught my eye across the table and raised her eyebrows, just slightly, but she didn't say a single word. She knew enough about my life adjustments to understand what that declined call truly represented, and the look she gave me was one of pure, silent female approval. After lunch, as we walked back to our classrooms, she squeezed my arm and told me, "You're doing great, Quinn." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That evening, my phone rang again while I was at my pottery class. My hands were covered in wet clay, working on a bowl that was actually, miraculously, starting to look like something Olivia might not be entirely embarrassed to display. I glanced at the screen and saw Robert's name. Without breaking my intense concentration on centering the clay, I simply returned my full attention to the wheel and kept working. Olivia noticed the phone call and my conscious decision to ignore it. She gave me an approving nod, the kind of silent acknowledgement that passes between women who understand what it takes to ignore a ringing phone when you've spent years jumping to answer every single call, dropping everything to accommodate someone else's immediate needs. Over the next 2 days, Robert called 6 more times. 6 calls, ignored. Each ignored call felt like reclaiming a small piece of my soul, a piece I had given away without even realizing the transaction was happening. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, Thursday evening, Friday at noon, Friday evening, Saturday morning. The calls kept coming, and I kept declining them with increasing, cold satisfaction. I was not being vindictive or cruel. I was simply following the rules he had established. He would decide when we communicated. He had not yet decided. The fact that his attempts to initiate contact didn't count as deciding was a logical nuance he had completely failed to consider when establishing his original, arrogant rulebook. This story isn't just about revenge, it's about reclaiming your edge. It's about being the main character in your own life, not the disposable supporting cast member. Are you someone who follows the crowd, or are you the one who dictates the narrative and makes the tough choices? If you want more stories of people who flip the script and win big, prove it right now. Click subscribe and show you're a winner, not a waiter. If you're going to miss out and stay silent, then comment, "I'm okay with being a background character," and explain why you're not ready to take center stage. Don't be boring. On day 14, the calls finally stopped and the frantic text messages began. The first one arrived during my planning period at school. It was brief and polite, just asking if I was okay. I read it, put my phone back down, and did not respond. The second message came an hour later, expressing total confusion about why I wasn't answering his calls or texts. The third message, arriving that evening, carried a different, more desperate tone, raw frustration bleeding through the carefully worded sentences. He said he didn't understand what was happening, that we needed to talk immediately, and that my silence was making things worse. I read each message as it arrived and calmly deleted it without a response. What could I possibly say that would not completely undermine the perfect logic of my position? He had told me to stop bothering him, so I had stopped. He had said he would decide when we communicated, so I was patiently waiting for him to decide. By the end of the second week, the physical evidence of Robert's deterioration became impossible to ignore. He had essentially stopped eating regular meals, something I could easily deduce from the towering accumulation of takeout containers in the kitchen trash, Chinese food cartons, pizza boxes, fast food bags. The man who used to insist on proper, home-cooked dinners every night was apparently now living on whatever cheap, quick calories he could order for delivery in his solitude. His expensive dress shirts were fitting looser around his collar and shoulders, visible evidence that he was losing weight from stress and irregular, chaotic eating. The deep, dark circles under his eyes told their own terrifying story of exhaustion. He was not sleeping well, probably lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, wondering how his perfectly planned, controlled life had suddenly spiraled completely out of his grasp. I knew he was up at odd hours because I could hear him pacing back and forth in his home office at 3 in the morning, the old floorboards creaking rhythmically under his restless movement. Sometimes I would hear the faint sound of his voice on a phone call at hours when no reasonable business call would ever be taking place. His carefully maintained image, always so critical to him as he cultivated the big-shot attorney destined for partnership, was beginning to show severe cracks. I noticed a visible coffee stain on his tie one morning, a small, unthinkable imperfection he never would have tolerated when I was managing the minute details of his life. His hair looked uncombed more often than not. His jaw frequently showed stubble, suggesting he had skipped shaving for a day or two. His expensive leather shoes had lost their signature polish. The man who had confidently told me I would never be on his level was now discovering what his level actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. Every small detail I had managed, every task I had handled without being asked, every convenience I had arranged to make his life run smoothly, had vanished without a trace. And watching him struggle with the basic adult maintenance of his own existence brought me a deep, complex, and undeniable satisfaction. What Robert did not know, what he could not have possibly predicted because he had always fundamentally underestimated me, was that I had been meticulously documenting everything. While he was falling apart trying to manage his own life, I was building an absolutely airtight case for why our marriage had failed and who bore the soul-crushing responsibility for that failure. I kept a detailed journal hidden in my car where he would never, ever find it, recording every dismissive comment, every instance where he prioritized his career over our relationship, every single act of casual cruelty. The pages were filling up with evidence written in my own clear hand. I had copies of our financial records, downloaded onto a thumb drive that Amelia Reeves had instructed me to keep somewhere safe. The records showed with undeniable clarity how much of my teacher's income had gone towards supporting his career advancement, while my own student loans remained largely unpaid. I had screenshots of text messages where he cancelled plans with one-line callous excuses. I had emails where he dismissed my concerns as utterly unimportant compared to his massive work obligations. I even had a small private recording from our last, disastrous marriage counselling session, the one he had shown up 30 minutes late to and then dominated by listing my supposed inadequacies. Amelia was going to use all of it. The day of the confrontation arrived on Friday, exactly 2 weeks after he had told me I wasn't on his level. My sister, Michelle, dropped off a beautiful outfit at school for me, a sharp, professional charcoal pantsuit, and I changed in the teacher's bathroom. It felt like I was putting on armor, ready for a legal battle. I walked into the school lobby with a calm, unshakable confidence I hadn't felt in years. Robert's face, when he saw me, transformed immediately. Relief flooded his features, followed instantly by desperate, pathetic hope. He took a quick step toward me, and I noticed that his carefully maintained appearance was now showing severe signs of strain. His suit was still immaculate. He was an attorney after all, but his face looked visibly haggard. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced than they had been even a few days earlier, and he had lost enough weight that his collar seemed slightly too large. He started talking before I could say a word, the words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic panicked rush. Robert made his living crafting perfect arguments and maintaining complete control in high-stakes negotiations, but right now he sounded like a man who had completely lost his script and was improvising very, very badly. He said he had been trying to reach me for days. He said he'd been calling and texting and couldn't understand why I was not responding. He held out a bouquet of store-bought, wilted roses toward me like they were some sacred peace offering that would magically reset everything between us. He launched into an explanation. He had been under tremendous stress with the partnership review. He admitted he might have said some things he didn't really mean. He even suggested we go to dinner that evening at Angelo's, the fancy Italian restaurant I used to love, a place we hadn't been to in over a year because he was always too busy. But apparently now, he suddenly had all the time in the world. He talked about reconnecting and working through our problems and how much he missed me. He said he missed us, as if we had been a functioning partnership, rather than a completely one-sided arrangement where I gave everything and he simply took it as his due entitlement. The entire performance was desperate and pathetically transparent. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the belief that a quick public display of vulnerability, a cheap bouquet, and the right words would solve this problem the way he solved every other complication in his corporate life. I stood there, looking at him, while the lobby around us grew progressively quieter. Several teachers had stopped what they were doing and were now watching with undisguised open fascination. Mrs. Henderson, the notoriously nosy librarian, had abandoned all pretense of working and was staring at the drama unfolding with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. A small group of 5 or 6 students waiting for late pickups had gone completely silent, sensing with that intuitive awareness children have that something monumentally important was happening, even if they couldn't understand the adult context. When I finally spoke, my voice carried clearly through the hushed lobby. I was surprised by how calm I sounded, how steady, how utterly devoid of emotion. "Robert," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "you established very clear ground rules for our marriage 2 weeks ago. You said you would decide when we talked or spent time together. You told me to stop chasing you." I paused, letting that sink in completely. "What is happening right now," I continued, "is not you deciding we should talk. This is you deciding you want to talk. That's an entirely different thing, isn't it?" I explained that he wanted me to be available on demand, to come running the very second he experienced even mild discomfort from the consequences of his own choices. "That, Robert, is not how this works anymore." My voice remained calm and perfectly measured, but every single word was deliberate. I was not being emotional, I was not being vindictive, I was simply following the logical, unassailable conclusion of the rules he himself had established. Robert blinked at me and I watched genuine, total confusion cross his face. In his world, people did not tell him no. Opposing counsel might argue their positions, but eventually, negotiations happened. Compromises were reached, and Robert always got his way. This absolute, unyielding calm compliance was something entirely outside his professional corporate playbook. I could see the shift happen in his posture and his expression. His jaw tightened instantly. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a sharp, ugly edge that made several of the watching children instinctively take a step back toward their parents. "I am your wife," he snapped, and the way he said it suggested that this single fact alone should compel my absolute obedience. "You cannot just ignore me for 2 weeks like I don't even exist. What you are doing is manipulative. It constitutes emotional abuse." The accusation was so completely absurd, so utterly lacking in self-awareness, that I actually laughed out loud. The sound surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. It wasn't a bitter laugh or a cruel one. It was genuine, cold amusement at the complete intellectual dishonesty he was displaying. Here was a man who had told me I would never be on his level, who had called marrying me an act of lowering himself, who had demanded I stop bothering him and wait silently until he decided he wanted my attention. And now he was standing in my workplace, on a public school campus, accusing me of emotional abuse because I had given him exactly what he had demanded. "I am following your instructions perfectly, Robert," I stated clearly. "You requested that I stop chasing you, so I stopped. You established that you would determine when we communicated, so I am patiently waiting for you to determine that. You told me I would never be on your level and that you had lowered yourself by marrying me. So I am respecting your superior judgment by maintaining the appropriate, dignified distance." The logic was flawless. I delivered it with the exact same calm, clinical precision he had used when unilaterally restructuring our marriage 2 weeks earlier. Now, not only were the teachers watching, but the school secretary, Mrs. Davis, was out of her office, observing the entire spectacle unfold. I could see in her eyes a professional concern for the scene, something that might risk requiring administrative action. But I also noticed something else in her eyes. It looked almost like a silent nod of approval for how I was handling this confrontation. Robert stood there, holding his bouquet of wilting roses, and I could see him desperately trying to find an angle, a flaw in the logic, some argument, any way to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely beyond his management. His mouth opened and closed several times as he searched for words that simply would not come. Then his voice changed again. It dropped to something almost pleading, a vulnerable, pathetic tone I had genuinely never heard from him in 3 years of marriage. He asked brokenly, "What do you want from me, Quinn?" The question itself revealed how little he truly understood about what was happening. This wasn't a corporate negotiation where I had a list of demands that could be met with a cash offer. This was not a contract dispute where the right concession would bring me back to the table. He started offering concessions like he was in a losing deposition. He called himself an idiot. He admitted he had been stressed and had taken it out on me. He acknowledged he had said things he should not have said. Each admission came out carefully, meticulously worded, and I could see him watching my face for signs that his calculated strategy was working. He suggested we go somewhere private to talk about this like adults, as if privacy would somehow make his casual cruelty easier to forgive or forget. As if the problem was that we were having this conversation in public rather than the core content of what he had cruelly said to me 2 weeks earlier. I looked at him standing there, his expensive suit now looking rumpled, his desperation hanging in the air, and I realized something profound. I was not looking at the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. That man was gone, replaced by a self-important, arrogant lawyer who only saw me as a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, and a disposable asset. I realized that what I wanted from him was simply nothing. No apology, no reconciliation, no money, no explanation. I simply wanted him out of my life, a clean, immediate severance. This is the moment of truth. Quinn is strong enough to say no. Are you? If you've ever let someone talk you out of your worth, if you've ever had to beg for respect, you know the crushing price of silence and submission. Don't let your strength be a fleeting feeling. Make a commitment to yourself right now. Subscribe to lock in your resolve and claim your power. If you choose not to subscribe, you are signaling to the world that you are comfortable with being a pushover and that you're okay with going back to the person who hurt you. Go ahead and comment, "I am a pushover and I won't subscribe," and tell us why you're okay with staying weak and compliant. The single, most powerful word that came out of my mouth was simple, revolutionary, and complete. No. Not an explanation, not a justification, not an apology for saying it, just no. I told him I was not going to dinner with him, we were not going to talk, I was going to finish my work week, and I was going home to my apartment. I made absolutely sure to emphasize that last part. My apartment, not our house. My apartment that I had quietly found and rented without his input or permission. I explained that I was going to enjoy a peaceful weekend without walking on eggshells or wondering if my very existence was annoying him. I suggested that he should leave the school, return to his office, and start getting used to what his life looked like without me managing every single detail of it. My voice remained perfectly calm throughout this entire devastating speech. I was not angry or emotional. I was simply a woman stating an unchangeable fact. My confidence wasn't anger. It was the quiet, solid sound of a door being locked forever. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the wilting roses hanging uselessly in his hand. He was completely defeated. He turned, the picture of a successful lawyer who had just suffered an epic public fail. He walked out of the school lobby, and the sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking on the tiled floor was the last sound he would ever make in my life. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence of the lobby, which felt like the most beautiful sound in the world, a song I was finally learning to sing after years of complete, self-imposed silence. I had real responsibilities here, in this classroom, real work that created actual tangible value in the world. 22 second graders depended on me to teach them how to read, how to write, and how to think critically about the world around them. They depended on me to help them navigate conflicts with friends and understand complex concepts. They depended on me to model what kindness and respect looked like in practice. And I was good at this work. I was genuinely profoundly good at it, in ways that had absolutely nothing to do with salary or status or any of the cold, transactional metrics Robert had used to measure my worth. My life was finally, gloriously, completely mine again, and it felt incredible. That weekend, I met with Amelia Reeves in her stunning downtown office. She had asked me to come in on Saturday morning to finalize our comprehensive strategy. She laid out the next steps with the precision of a master chess player, outlining exactly how and when the divorce papers would be served. The following Monday morning, I was back in my classroom at Piedmont Elementary, teaching my students about subtraction, taking what you don't need out of your life, subtracting what no longer served you. The concepts felt profoundly applicable beyond mathematics. At exactly 11:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Amelia. The message contained only one powerful word: delivered. I excused myself from the classroom for a moment, stepping into the quiet hallway where I could take a deep breath without 22 small humans watching my reaction. The divorce papers had been formally served to Robert at his office. Amelia had arranged for the process server to arrive during mid-morning, when the big law office would be at its busiest. Maximum witness count, she had explained during our Saturday meeting. Robert would open that envelope, the formal notification ending our marriage, in front of his colleagues, in front of the managing partners who were currently deciding his entire future at the firm. I imagined his face when he saw the legal documents. The careful corporate composure he worked so relentlessly hard to maintain would crack, shatter, in front of the people whose opinions he valued more than anything in the world. The thought brought me a fierce satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with poetic justice. He had humiliated me in private, behind a closed door. Now, he would experience a fraction of that humiliation in the professional setting he cared about more than anything else. That afternoon, during my lunch break, I drove to the nearest phone store in a totally different part of the city. The clerk who helped me was efficient and professional, transferring my contacts and data to a brand new SIM card without asking why I needed a new number. I watched the process happen and felt something significant shift. This new number represented a clean, technological break from my old life. Robert would no longer be able to call or text me. He would try my old number and find it disconnected. One more undeniable piece of evidence that I was completely serious about ending this marriage and erasing him from my existence. I erased him from my social media presence as thoroughly as I intended to erase him from my actual life. Tuesday morning brought a complication I had not anticipated. I was walking my students to the pickup area at the end of the school day when I saw Clara, Robert's sister, standing near the entrance. Clara looked upset and completely disheveled in a way that was entirely unusual for her. Clara always presented herself with careful, expensive polish, but today her hair was slightly messy and her makeup showed clear signs of having been applied hastily. She pulled me aside to a quieter area near the main office. Her voice carried confusion and distress when she asked, "What in the world is happening, Quinn?" Robert had called her the night before in a total panic, she said, talking about divorce papers being served at his office and how I had abandoned him without any warning. Clara was confused because she genuinely liked me. I was the one who had always hosted her for holidays, remembered her birthday, and kept the peace in her family. I looked her straight in the eye and told her the truth, calmly and directly. I told her the exact words Robert had said to me. "I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you. You were never and will never be anywhere near my level." I told her I had given him exactly what he asked for, silence and distance. And when he finally realized he needed me, I told him no. I explained that I was not a dog that would come running just because he whistled. Clara nodded slowly. I could see the painful, awful realization dawning on her face. Her successful, charming, arrogant brother had created this entire, life-altering mess entirely on his own. By Wednesday evening, Robert had apparently moved through several more stages of responding to the divorce papers. My friend Riley called me around 7 while I was at home in my new apartment, still unpacking boxes. She had seen several posts Robert had made on Facebook. I couldn't see them myself because I had blocked him immediately, but they were visible to our mutual friends and his extended professional network. Riley read them to me, her voice carrying barely suppressed outrage. Robert had posted vague, victim-sounding statements about how marriage takes work and communication, about how some people give up instead of fighting for what matters, and about how he was learning painful lessons about trust and commitment. The posts were carefully politically crafted to make him look like the wronged party, the devoted, exhausted husband struggling to understand why his wife had suddenly cruelly abandoned him without warning. Several of his high-powered colleagues and law school friends had commented with supportive, pitying messages. They clearly had no idea what had actually happened. They were responding to the completely fabricated narrative Robert was constructing, one where he was the victim of my unreasonable behavior rather than the architect of his entire relationship's collapse. Riley was absolutely furious on my behalf. She wanted to comment on his posts and set the record straight publicly, a total tea spill in the comments section. But I told her I felt only cold, serene amusement at his transparent attempt to control the narrative and position himself as the victim. It was such a predictable, lawyerly move from someone who made his entire living shaping stories to suit his desired outcome. I told Riley the absolute truth about what Robert had said to me, the exact soul-crushing words he had used that Tuesday night, and I gave her my explicit permission to spread that information through our friend group as she saw fit. I was finally done protecting his fragile reputation and letting him rewrite the history of our marriage. I trusted Riley to handle it with the perfect balance of directness and discretion. She had a large network of mutual friends and a true talent for strategic information sharing. By the end of the week, most of our social circle would know exactly what Robert had said to me and why I had finally walked away. I hung up the phone and looked around my new apartment. Boxes were still stacked everywhere, waiting to be unpacked. My few pieces of furniture looked sparse in the space, but every single inch of it was mine. It belonged to me, and it reflected my choices rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's overblown preferences. The systematic dismantling of my marriage was proceeding exactly according to plan. Amelia's timeline was being followed with frightening precision. Robert's carefully constructed public image was beginning to crack as the truth spread through his professional world. He called me one last time, managing to get a message through by calling Michelle and begging her to relay his plea. He said he would hire a marriage counselor, that he would change, that he had realized he could not live without me. He pleaded with me to meet him just one more time to discuss reconciliation. I told Michelle to relay a final message. Tell Robert I have zero interest in descending to his level, where human worth was calculated purely by salary and status, where love was transactional and conditional, where marriage was something you stayed in only when the optics benefited your career advancement. I told him the divorce would proceed exactly as planned. Amelia had assured me that the settlement would be substantial, given that his partnership and the significant salary increase it brought would be considered marital property. I had supported him through law school by working 2 jobs and taking out loans that I was still paying off. I had facilitated his career advancement by managing every single aspect of his personal life so he could focus entirely on professional success. Under state law, I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. I explained that I would be walking away with enough money to pay off my student loans completely, buy a small house in the district I taught in, and start fresh with a substantial financial cushion. He, meanwhile, would be learning the incredibly expensive, life-altering lesson that treating people like disposable assets comes with a brutal price tag. I told Michelle to tell him I had everything I needed right here, in the apartment that was entirely mine. I stood in my kitchen after delivering that final, cold message, looking at the empty sink and feeling something profound settle inside me. It wasn't triumph exactly, though there was immense satisfaction in knowing I had handled that final confrontation with complete intellectual control. It was more like utter finality. The last thread connecting us had been severed. 4 months later, that legal process concluded in a conference room at Amelia's office. Robert and I sat on opposite sides of a polished mahogany table, signing documents that formally ended our marriage. His attorney was a sharp-looking woman who had clearly counselled him not to fight this battle. She reviewed the settlement terms with a professional efficiency that confirmed what I already knew. Robert was paying a very, very high price for his arrogance. I walked out of that high-rise office building carrying a settlement check that represented not only financial security, but the cold, hard cash equivalent of justice. I walked out and took a deep, clear breath of the Manhattan air. It was a life beyond his luxury level, but not for the reasons he once thought. It was a life where my worth was not tied to his status, where my future was entirely my own design. The feeling of finally being able to breathe freely was the most profound luxury of all. Reclaiming the energy and attention I had poured into a person who viewed my love as weakness and my support as entitlement. Understanding that I had always been exactly the right size, exactly the right level, exactly enough, and that Robert's inability to see that reflected his deficiency, not mine. I was a teacher who shaped young minds and made differences in children's lives that would ripple forward through generations. That was enough. That had always been enough. And if Robert ever figured out what he had truly lost, the woman who had loved him unconditionally before he taught her that some people do not deserve unconditional love, it would be far too late. The woman he tried to diminish had turned out to be stronger than he ever imagined. She had walked away with her dignity intact and her future bright with possibility, and she was drinking her coffee exactly how she liked it, in an apartment that was entirely hers, on a quiet Saturday morning that belonged to no one but herself. This story of calculated revenge and fully reclaimed power had you absolutely hooked from the jump. You made it to the end, proving you're the kind of person who deserves to win, the kind of person who won't quit on their own life story. My favourite part, the ultimate mic drop moment, was when Quinn stood in that school lobby, in front of all those witnesses, and calmly told Robert that she had secured her own apartment and was done, watching his entire carefully constructed world crumble in real time. What was your favourite moment of her incredible journey? What part made you sit up and say, "That's how it's done"? Go ahead, drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of strength, self-respect, and ultimate justice like this one. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never, ever miss a story that changes the way you look at your own worth. The next story is even more epic, but you won't get the alert if you haven't subscribed. Don't be the one who misses out on your own personal revolution. Click subscribe now.